and I am currently an education advisor for Concilium Academies Trust. I've been teaching science for about 14 years, and I'm also a regular presenter on Teacher Hug Radio, and I started a YouTube channel a couple of years ago for teaching and learning resources and things like that, called TNT Teaching and Learning, and my email's on there. I'm sure Tony will share the presentation. So if you do want to contact me afterwards, if you've got any questions, that's fine. So I've just come here to talk about some techniques that you can use using a visualizer in terms of giving effective feedback. Now, this all sort of started a couple of years ago when the school I worked at, I was reviewing the evidence in terms of teacher workload and making sure feedback was effective. And one of the things we brought into our school was a feedback not marking policy into our school. And it aimed to provide more effective feedback for the students, but also try and reduce some of that workload for teachers as well. Because as teachers, we spend a lot of time marking, and sometimes it's not always purposeful, especially when it's happened quite a long time, a couple of weeks after the students have been in this specific lesson, which you're giving feedback on. So these are just a couple of techniques that you could use using a visualizer. Visualizers come in all different ranges of prices, so you get quite cheap ones for about £50–60, the Hue HD ones, or you can get some really advanced ones from ed tech companies which have some extra features. So the first thing I'm just going to talk about is something called front end feedback, and this really helped me when I was teaching in terms of when I was marking books. I'd come across the same mistakes over and over again that the students had made, and what I did first of all as a teacher when I was teaching a specific exam question, or it might be a piece of writing to explain a concept, or it might be writing a method or a conclusion or something like that in the lesson, was I'd first try and identify any common misconceptions or mistakes that I'd seen in the past as a teacher, but also read online and read in books and things like that. So I knew I had a good idea of what things students would commonly make mistakes on. And then what I would do is I'd create a mock answer. So if I was doing an exam question, for example, I would put together a mock answer. And one of the things which is really useful when you're doing it for exam questions specifically is a lot of the exam papers have examiner reports. And they're quite interesting to see what students across the country, common mistakes that they're making. I'll show you an example in a second. And I would just highlight these statements and use them when I was discussing it with students in the lesson. I'd ask them first, right, looking at this example, why have I highlighted these certain mistakes? Why do you think these are misconceptions? And I'd then come up with a list of common hazards or misconceptions, so that when they went on to write the question or do a similar question, then they could take those into account and they wouldn't make those same mistakes. So when we came to mark the work, it was a lot easier and a lot quicker for the students had to make those mistakes in the first place. So it's kind of front ending it and making sure the mistakes weren't made. And that used to save me a lot of time writing the same comments in student books as the mistakes that commonly occur throughout the work that they've done. So this is just an example of a question which I do. It's a physics one where you look at the required practical for density and irregular shapes. So I would talk through this, and I would look at the examiner report, and this is an example of the examiner report, and I underlined or highlighted there some of the common mistakes which students were making across the country, and then I put that into an example here which you can see. So I wrote an example question and I highlighted things that were nearly correct and I highlighted things which were totally incorrect, and I gave students a bit of time and to go away and identify why I said they're nearly correct or why I said they were totally incorrect. And then we'd come up with that list, which they would then apply to a similar question. You can see on the right there's a similar question, and I got them to write it. And you can do this for any piece of writing which the students do. Another thing on the last slide is, if you're not sure if it's to do with a concept and you want to explain a concept, there's a really good book there, Making Sense of Secondary Science, which you can get. I think the first edition's a lot cheaper on eBay, by Rosalind Drive and the rest of the people on the front of that picture. That's a really good book in understanding what misconceptions students have around common ideas in science. So that might be something to look at when you're doing this particular example. Something else which I do within a lesson using a visualizer is strategic sampling. So with this, again, it helped me to spot common mistakes and then to address those live within the lesson so that students weren't making those mistakes, and I was identifying those misconceptions early on. So what I would do is I'd set students off on a task. It might be, explaining the concept or writing out a conclusion, and then I would circulate the room and point out any errors or praise students for, particularly good science which they were writing about. And then based on that, I would strategically choose books to show quickly under the visualizer, and I would then question students and say, right, let's have a look at this, let's live mark this together. Why is this student, and why would you say this is incorrect? Or what could the student do to improve it? Or what's really good about this statement the student's made? And then the students would then be able to see improvements or things which are really good, and that would help the rest of the students then to make improvements to their work halfway through. And I would continuously do that throughout that section to make sure that students weren't making those same mistakes over and over again. And that again helped me when I came to mark books or look at books, because I wasn't seeing 10 students making the same mistake over and over again. And I think it also helps in terms of identifying that misconception straight away and explaining that, as opposed to students going away and thinking about that misconception and more of it staying in their memory and staying in their brain. You could also do this after the lesson as well. So I have done this after the lesson where I just sample a few books and I would put it under the visualizer and make a recording of myself doing the live marking. So if you don't have time in a lesson to do it, you can do it afterwards, and you can make a visualizer by recording what you're doing through your speech and through your live marking, and then you can play that at the start of the next lesson and get students to improve the work then. Every year, sort of a folder with really good examples of work, especially when I'm doing quite long, extensive pieces of writing. And I would show that to students at the beginning of the lesson and say, this is what we're aiming for. And that helps to not only maintain the high standards, making sure that all students are doing the best work they can do, but also realistic, because it's from pupils that have been in that year group and they've done that work themselves. So the students can see that that work is achievable. And if you pitch it correctly, by showing this gold standard of work, it can also boost the motivation of students and confidence, which is called vicarious experience, where you sort of learn from people who have success in something, and they sort of have this feeling of, well, if another person in my year group can do it, then I can do it. And then finally, on to success criteria. So I do this quite a lot when I want, again, to get students to do an activity when I'm modelling something. So when they actually start the task, they know what things to include, so that reduces my time marking the work afterwards. So prior to them starting independent practice, I would get them to generate success criteria. I would give them the success criteria straight away. Sometimes I do it as a Word document and just show it on the screen, or I would do it written by hand as the students were giving me those success criteria, those points. And when I'm modelling it, I would refer to it and say, this is how I've made sure that I've labelled the y-axis. I'm using pencil here. This is just an example of drawing a graph. And then I would then give them time to improve later on. So I come back to the success criteria once they finish the activity, and I get them then to look at which things they've done well and which things they could improve, and then give them that time to improve on the work. And an added feature to this as well, if you've got quite a good visualizer, you can just use the microphone, and if you're using typing on Google or you're using Microsoft Word, there's like a microphone version. You can just click it and you can just type in the words as opposed to having to type them out live on screen. And that's it from me. So are there any questions which anyone wants to ask around that?
It's a really good way of using visualizers, which I'd not quite thought of before. But which ones would you recommend having video, and how do you do the video and record bit? Is that through the visualizer or through a camera on your computer?
So in terms of visualizers, it's dead easy to set up. You can get the Hue HD visualizers, I think from Amazon, for about £60, I think. And they're really good to start off with. All you do is just plug it into your laptop or your PC, and then you just go onto the camera function on your Windows PC, and it just opens it up. You flip the camera around so you can see the student work with the visualizer underneath, and that's it. Some of the higher end visualizers, they have specific software on them, which is really good because you can sort of record things, or you can annotate over things on the whiteboard if it's connected to an interactive whiteboard, and you can also record things with your voice as well. Some of the cheaper ones you can't necessarily do that. You can just see the picture on the screen.